My name's Zach Sullivan. I am a regional VP of enterprise sales at Seclore. Just celebrated my 7-year anniversary. I'm on the strategic side, so I'm really focused on analysis of trends in the cybersecurity marketplace, where are breaches coming in, what are the cybersecurity regulations, and working on aligning myself with the right company at the right time. Okay? And I've been here for 7 years. And I will say there's certainly been some up and downs, but I've never seen the amount of interest that I've seen across the board, or actually the company has seen over the last year. We grew 50%, went from 250 employees to about 350 employees today, working to push that number up to 450 employees by next year. I grew up a few towns over from a place called Charlestown, Massachusetts. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Charlestown, Massachusetts. Or maybe if you've seen a movie called The Town. Charlestown, Massachusetts is and was and has been for a while the epicenter of the world of bank robbing. It is literally was the school of bank robbers, the most successful bank robbers in the world. And I'm not saying that I've robbed a bank, but I'm not saying that I couldn't either. And I'll give you an example because I think there's a lot of parallels between cybersecurity criminals and physical criminals in the bank robbing space. So what are you going to do, right? If I was going to be a bank robber, what am I going to do? Well, certainly I'm going to take my time. I'm probably going to set up a shop. I'm probably going to get an apartment close by whatever bank I think has the most money. I'm going to keep an eye on who's there. Who are the weakest links? What time do they come in? What time do they leave? When does the cash get in? Who has access to the vault? I'm going to wait. I'm going to take my turn. And I'm going to plan this out very carefully of when the right time to go in is. And at that time, I'm going to go in, guns blazing. Everybody get on the ground. I know exactly who to go to who has access to the vault. My plan is to fill up my bags as fast as humanly possible and get out of there before I can get caught, right? So imagine a situation where I'm walking up, I've got the right person who has access to the vault. I get the vault open, I've got my bags in hand, I'm ready to burst through the door. I open up that vault and I look in, and every single dollar inside that bank vault is protected with its own bank vault. See, I think that we need to really flip the switch on how we look at the adversary today. What's their incentive, right? Their incentive is to get their hands on this data as quick as possible and get out. The topic of today, you can see, is the harmless breach. And what I mean by harmless breach is, I think if we look at network and endpoint security controls today, and we look at the money that's been spent, right? If I look at the money that's been spent, $172 billion was spent on cybersecurity in 2022. It went up again in 2023, another $20 billion. But so did the amount of reported breaches, right? Day after day after day, I'm looking at these breaches and they're continuing to take place. So what does that tell me? It tells me that I don't think it's a spend problem. I think we can have as much money to go to this problem and do the same thing today as we've been doing for the last 10 years, and we're in the same boat. So when I say harmless breach, what do I mean by harmless breach? I mean, I want to flip the switch so if somebody gets into the system, that the impact of that breach is going to change. It didn't mean that somebody didn't get to the bank vault. It meant that when they got to the bank vault, every single dollar inside that bank vault was protected with its own bank vault. Why is that important? Because nobody's going to take the time to try to decrypt every single file within that file folder, right? To try to ransom that information. We can prove that somebody doesn't have access, or somebody has access, but they don't have possession of that data, right? Possession shouldn't equal control. Meaning, if I've sent something to somebody else, and it's in their inbox, that shouldn't give them the right to just do whatever they want to do with that. And what type of data am I talking about really today? Well, I mean, that's a place I think a lot of organizations, a lot of cyber professionals, security professionals really need to think is, what's the end goal? When I'm looking at this, what is truly the end goal of my position And I would say protecting data is probably one of the biggest end goals, right? I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do. And if the end goal is to get to data protection, now I need to work my way back. How do I get to data protection? How do I make it so if somebody gets into my system, that they're not going to have access or possession of my data? How do I get it so that if I need to share sensitive data with a third party, that third party who I've shared that data with doesn't have permission to do whatever they want? And furthermore, that same situation about the bank vault now applies to third parties for third-party risks. How does that switch the conversation that you're going to have with your customers, that you're going to have with your employees? If I'm going to say, I've got a breach, my data was stolen, versus somebody got into the system, but I can prove to you right now that they never had access to that data. There was a third-party breach because I'm working with a payroll company, I'm working with a lawyer, I'm working with a consultant, I'm working with a vendor, I'm working with a supplier. Somebody gets into that third party, and now I could have to report that there was a third-party breach. But if I can prove that nobody touched my data, how does that change that conversation, especially when it comes to a breach? How can we protect data persistently? Regardless of the device, regardless of the network, regardless of the type of file format, right? I think data protection for a long time has been, how do I protect my enterprise from getting infiltrated, right? Or the network level and the network controls. But so much has changed about the way that data is shared right now. The volumes of data, the velocity of data, the type of file formats. The amount of data that's being shared on a daily basis right now is staggering. So there's a problem right now, not just internally, but externally, which is at some point this data is very likely going beyond my control. And if I look at this, I could have classification tools, I certainly could have CASB tools, discovery tools, DLP tools, still all constrained to the corporate boundary, right? A DLP tool might be able to find sensitive data, but it certainly has to make a yes-no decision when that data leaves the organization. Does it leave, yes or no? How realistic is it to block all that sensitive data that's leaving the organization? It's really not. Think about classification, right? Classification certainly has its place. Let's classify, let's label our data. But shouldn't that be mapped to a data protection strategy? Does it really make sense to classify my data and not add a level of protection to that data? I mean, I know it's sensitive. I know this is PII data. I know it's PHI data, right? Does it make sense for me to classify my data and not add a level of protection to that data? So one of the things that's shifted now, and I'll talk about that a little bit, is the way that you can leverage these tools that are content aware, meaning I know what type of data this is, to add data protection policies that are going to stay with that data regardless of where that data travels. Where's that data traveling right now? Well, it's certainly traveling to third parties, right? Supply chain, fabricators, investors, consultants, law firms. What types of files am I looking at right now? Can I realistically lock it down to a certain file format and just say, I'm only using Microsoft file format? What about if I have PDF files? What about if I have image files? What about if I have text files? What about if I have CAD files? Is Microsoft going to protect those files? Well, the fact of the matter is no, and a lot of people look at Microsoft, have an E3, E5 license, and they want to use Microsoft for data protection, right? Makes sense, because it's part of the package. How realistic is that to really get you there? What are the gaps? Understand what those gaps are. I'll talk a little bit about those today, but certainly it makes sense for everybody who's thinking about it or has E3 or E5 to understand what those gaps are. 95% of our customers are Microsoft E3 or E5 customers. So where's this data traveling? Well, I can't control and say, no, nobody can use this on a mobile application. Nobody can use it on their iPod. The further I go up the chain at some of these large customers of mine, American Express, Ford, many others, a lot of these folks don't even have a laptop, right? They might have an iPad and they've got a mobile device. That's it. So I need to make sure that data is protected on any type of device. And it might go into Box, it might go into Dropbox. Let's give another example. Let's think LLMs, right? Let's think Gen AI. Let's think Copilot, right? Copilot. And what's the risk there? Certainly indexing. This is a way to be able to stop that, right? If Seclore is protecting those files, or these type of files are protected with EDRM, Enterprise Digital Rights Management. Core competency of Seclore is Enterprise Digital Rights Management, classification, integrations with DLP tools so that you could be content aware and protect that data regardless of where it travels. But Gen AI and Copilot, for example, great use cases for this. I don't want that data to be indexed. Can I prevent that from happening? The answer there is yes. This is a gap that I think we all need to think about right now between perimeter-based controls, endpoint security, network security, cloud security. I want that data to be protected. If I really care about data protected, any user, any device, any application, regardless of the location, I want file security, data security to travel with that data anywhere it travels, regardless of device, regardless of the network, regardless of the application. There's a lot of different use cases out here. I mentioned Ford and I mentioned American Express. I'd say Ford really sits heavy on the left here. What do they really care about? They care about their IP. Now, they work with fabricators, they work with suppliers. If I'm Ford Motor Company, I might make 20% of that vehicle. But there's so many parts inside of that vehicle that it's gonna get outsourced to, right? So I've got fabricators and suppliers who I'm working with this whole supply chain to help me build that vehicle, but I wanna make sure that that data is safe. I don't want somebody to see a picture of the new vehicle that I have a launch date going out to right now in 3 weeks because I want that excitement, right? They really care about that. When you look at the Car and Driver magazine, for example, and you see a car driving and that car has got a giant sheet over it or tarp over it, that's because they don't want anybody. There's value in keeping that data safe and keeping that launch date to get as many views as possible, create as much of a buzz as possible. The thing about American Express, I think, certainly regulatory compliance requirements, PII data, a need to protect PII data as it travels downstream. Why? Because I need to adhere to regulatory compliance requirements. And guys, this is a big shift in how security professionals are starting to think about this role. Because GDPR, New York Data Privacy Act, CCPA, and so many other regulations are really putting a heavy emphasis on organizations always remaining in control of their data. Meaning that I'm responsible for data even when I send it past that corporate boundary. That's why if there's a third-party breach, I still have responsibility in that third-party breach. So for American Express, PII data, lots of loan officers, lots of information traveling back and forth, very heavily regulated. They want to make sure that they can meet the regulatory compliance requirements by being able to audit their externally facing PII data. Many other ones, and many of these that I've spoken here about today, are really important for organizations. But again, I think the bigger picture is my data should always be protected, regardless of the file format, regardless of where it's traveling, regardless if it's sitting within my organization. How can I prevent the impact of a breach if that breach takes place today? How can I limit the impact of that breach? How can I change the script? How can I change the incentive on the adversary that wants to get in and wants to steal that data? You know how I change it? I make sure that every one of those files is protected with its own key. Why? Because they're not going to take the time. They're going to move to the next guy, right? I wouldn't want to be that next guy. One of the things that's changed in this place today, and the reason EDRM's been around since the day of Napster. When I was a kid in high school, I'm downloading as much music as I possibly can. It's Napster, right? So it should have been the best thing then, because this is a level of encryption that's going to stay with that file forever. That's the way encryption always should have been. But there was too much emphasis on the end user to make those decisions on what they're going to protect, right? And this is the difference that can be really powerful today, especially for organizations that already have a CASB tool, a DLP tool, a discovery tool, or some type of controls in place. Is automatically protecting this data based on the content of this data, or automatically protecting this data based on the classification and the label of this data. So possession no longer has to equal control. Remember that. It's really, really positive. Possession no longer has to equal control. Encryption, dynamic controls. What can somebody do with the file? Can they print, edit, screen share? Being able to have active file security that stays with it. Dynamic watermarking. What does that mean? It means everybody who opens up the file has their own individual watermark. Much less likely to take a picture with their cell phone. So I think my time's up here. If you have any questions, please see me at some point as we're walking through. Stop by the Seclore booth. I would love to have the opportunity to talk to so many of you. I really appreciate the time here today. Thank you so much.